first met Andrew about 15 years ago when I was editor at Canadian Architect magazine, and he was an emerging voice, which was reinforced in 2003 when he was awarded the Canada Council for the Arts Prix de Rome. Some of the video material in the current exhibition originates from his time here. Andrew has worked with internationally recognized architects including Zaha Hadid in London and Brian McKay Lyons in Halifax. He is now design principal for Canada at CannonDesign, currently leading teams in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and overseeing projects across Canada and in Asia. His Capilano University Film School for CannonDesign was recently awarded the 2010 Canadian Architect Magazine Award of Excellence, and his Wilfrid Laurier University Sports Center for CannonDesign was recently awarded a 2012 AIA PA Award of Excellence. Andrew has also led his own design and research initiative, AKA, for over 20 years, creating architecture, urban design, installations, and publications, many of which have been recognized with awards, including an earlier Canadian Architect Award of Excellence, this one in 2000 for the Tross Keefe House, and another 2012 AIA PA Award of Excellence for Hawk House. Andrew has also taught extensively and has held the Gerald Sheff Visiting Professorship at McGill University School of Architecture, that was in 2012, and the Israeli Visiting Chair at Carleton University's Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism in 2009-10. In 2004, he was Visiting Professor at Copenhagen's Royal Academy of Art. He has held visiting, adjunct, and special faculty appointments in architecture at the University of Calgary, McGill, and Dalhousie, and led a 5-year research initiative with the Banff Center for the Arts. His critical art practice with Angela Silver has made in-situ and gallery-based installations across Canada and abroad, and he has lectured extensively at venues that include the Tate Gallery in London, the Spertus Institute in Chicago, the University of Lethbridge, Carleton University, La Sapienza University in Rome, New York University in Florence, the Royal Academy in Copenhagen, the Design Exchange in Toronto, the Confederation Arts Center in Charlottetown, the Stride Gallery in Calgary, the Walter Phillips Gallery in Banff, and this evening, the Ryerson University Department of Architectural Sciences. What took you so long? Please join me in welcoming Andrew King.
Let me do some thanking to start with, because I was a little bit remiss in the opening to thank everybody. And so I'm going to try and do this really quickly, but I am going to thank Colin Ripley for organizing both the exhibition and this lecture at the same time. It's been a privilege to be part of this. And great to be part of one of the schools in Toronto. I haven't really spent that much time in the Toronto academic world, and hopefully that will increase as my exposure to the Toronto world increases. This is a great school. It's got a great reputation. It's a real pleasure being here. Marco is what he didn't mention in the several pages of introduction was that we're old friends. And it's a great pleasure to be here with him and have helped organize this thing with a larger group that I'll mention in a minute. Thanks have to go to Safdar Abadi, one of my partners at CannonDesign, he's our education practice leader and works with universities and he helped set this up. And a big thank you to my partners for helping support this, Libris Yacoub and Walter Gadet, my leadership partners at the CannonDesign office here in Toronto. It's shown a great level of support for both the studio here in Toronto, the studio in Montreal, and for the work as we try to move it forward. Slides. So trans architecture is the name of the exhibition. Some people, the more inquisitive or critical people within my world, including Michele, have sort of quizzed me on what this means. And really, Mark and I had the opportunity to speak with some of the students about what this meant from a curatorial point of view. And really, it is really just trying to understand how different modes of practice can work and where and how they work. It's also trying to identify qualities of the practices that I'm involved in in both recent times and in upcoming times. And really, the trans is the primary word. Architecture is, as I've always said, a big umbrella. It is about a trans-Canadian experience. There's projects in this lecture and in the show, this presentation and in the show that go coast to coast. It's transdisciplinary. I'm going to look at art practice, small architecture practice, large practice. It is about and also the themes of an art practice and how it can inform the various vectors. It's about scale, shifts in scale, the scale of the exhibition itself, which has a certain understandability, and then one of the last projects we're going to talk about is the largest construction project in Canada right now, which is under construction in Montreal. And it's about trans-program, the understanding that formal strategies, tectonic strategies, preoccupations within making architecture can move across these scales and move across different programs. The practices that are really engaged in this are, this is the other side of the card that's available around, and I'm going to talk very quickly. CannonDesign, my role there is very clear. I'm leading the design practice there. We've got, we're really engaged in critical work and understanding how to make that, understanding the tools, and also understanding how to disseminate and understanding how to continue to support it within the studio, and how it really forms an armature for a studio culture within a large practice. The other practice is AKA, which is, as Marco said, has been going on for a long time. There's a couple of projects in here looking at that. And then Angela Silver, my work with her is really evidenced in the video that was playing here earlier, some of the work that's there. And Shauna McCabe, who was here earlier with Marco and I and his students, a curator who has consistently put us in various exhibitions across critically recognized galleries across Canada. We were talking about it again today and the issues that drove that. So I really do want to shout out though to the people on this list. There's a very, very core group. I'm not going to of what's been called the boys, I guess. And I'm not trying to be just because you look so much like boys, I guess. I don't know. And they've come from Montreal. They include James Lai, Guy McClintock, Shaheen Nambrati, Jeff Ma, and Nikolai Boyajev, and I've been massacring his name for 5 years now. These guys have been absolutely key in making this work. We've built the show in Montreal. We built models. We've been building models now for several months for this exhibition, and my heart goes out to you. The broader team of Toronto-based contributors: Ross Carter Wingrove, a great old friend who's been contributing to these things for years; Juliet Scudo, Ryan Palabroda, Kate, Ekaterina, Chris Redeker, Natalie Kirshen, Dylan Durst, Bernard Howe, Sam Willman, Jasper Silver King, and Jofi Schwanretets. Thank you very much. A big thank you, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it at the opening. This is a heartening experience to see this come together. I appreciate it. The lecture is fundamentally based on, or the talk is fundamentally based on Aaron Sprecher asked me in a critical practice lecture series at McGill University, he asked me to identify, he asked everybody who was lecturing that year to identify 10 words that drove the practice. And it was an interesting exercise. The words that I came up with really in that sort of curatorial construct, which was a bit applied, I mean, it was graphically interesting, really has sort of developed into a way in which we analyze the work, look at the work from a conceptual point of view. So those words are contingent, speed, surface, cinematic, speculation, politic, exile, identity, analog, remote, and fetish. And many of these words go back to my thesis work, and certainly the Rome work, and certainly are addressed in some of the other work that we're doing now. So the first part of this, I'm going to look at 6 projects that really look at these words, but the first part of this talk is going to be an introduction to them and a very quick look at some of the other work and some of the influences that's happening in both my studio, my small studio, the CannonDesign studio, Angela's studio, that's occurring simultaneously in the same house as my work, in the same studio space, and then other influences. So, and really the notion of speculation, the fact that different media, a sort of merging or a mashup of media techniques, found objects, found text, found influences, and how they can influence the work has been important. That's created a series of in situ installations. I'm not going to read the titles, hopefully you can read those, but this is work in various different galleries and institutions. With Angela. So this is really the art-based sort of generation of the work and several of the issues. The scrim specifically is really about an urban intervention and taking a piece of urban infrastructure and radically shifting it into an art presentation mechanism through the use of shadow and light and theatrical instruments. And then again, a series of, as I mentioned, Shauna McCabe's and other curators' support in putting our work in galleries with both group shows and solo shows, but with very interesting sort of collaborators, whether it's Brian McKay-Lyons, whether it's Shim Sutcliffe, Chris Down, various different ways in which architecture and art converge, and we've been enjoyed a great sort of sequence of these over the last 5 years. And then as a precursor to this show, the work that we do ourselves to create a kind of curatorial position on the architecture that we're creating and how we can install them both in and transform gallery spaces. So this is essentially much the same concept that's in the show just outside, but it's in the Maison d'Architecture de Quebec, but really pushed through the lens of cinematics, so really focusing on how cinematic ideas and cinematic notions can inform the architecture. That notion of speculation moves to CannonDesign. This is work we did for the DSA in Washington, D.C., a speculative workshop looking at buildings owned by the U.S. government and how they could be reused. And again, a very, very speculative exercise that brought about then a series of more pragmatic solutions. The notion of the analog is absolutely important. The idea that both the tectonic, the made, the crafted is absolutely, will fundamentally remain part of architectural culture. And how that relates to architecture in many ways, the tectonic surface, the haptic condition. This is a house, just one house we did in Calgary, but really each drawing is handmade. It's ink on mylar. We continue to make handmade drawings, handmade models, and both speculative models and form-based models. The notion of surface, the fact that there is that haptic experience that we move up against, and it is the primary engagement within architecture once it's visually understood. The importance of that and how it can be layered with meaning, particularly in the gallery context with Angela's work, how the gallery surfaces and the walls get deformed through some sort of active critical engagement. And then the surface architecture, the notion that a drawing, these are pulled ink drawings made with cardboard and mylar for a project in Calgary, the actual engagement of the surface as a representational tool, and then those surfaces, how they get represented in various forms of architecture. This is the Tross-Keefe house that Marco discussed, where one particular construction technology is represented on the surface through the wood panels, wood frame, and then the masonry technology is represented in other ways, and the architecture really does, its surface condition is an authentic understanding of construction technology. The notion of speed really drives my understanding of the world. It's driven the video work that I've spoken about. This is work we did along the Turcotte interchange in Montreal for one of Shauna's exhibitions, and really it's two films on the Turcotte, one which is essentially a 20-minute long pan across the Turcotte, moving along it in a single shot, and then a series of fragmented video constructs from the context around. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we constructed those or how we developed this methodology when I talk about the Rome work. Identity, both identity and political identity, a kind of gender identity, an identity with identity's relationship with architecture is absolutely key. And the video work for Motelization, highway number 20 from Montreal to New Brunswick, was explored as a place in which you stopped, as a series of hotels, as a series of signage elements that then these ubiquitous rooms became the places in which you found your existence. These films are all about 20 minutes long, so I'm not going to go through them. This will be the first thought. The notion of the politic, I tell my students often that architecture is fundamentally a political act, and you cannot remove the politics from the making of a building. And then more specifically, the relationship with exile in architecture has been a research stream since my thesis. The understanding that you belong to a place, your notions of citizenship, notions of identifying yourself with both a constructed landscape of the city and that being a fundamental part of your place in the world. I spent about 8 years in Berlin after graduating from university. Ross and Anne-Marie, who are here, were there around the same time. And we did a series of Canada Council for the Arts funded research projects. It was based fundamentally on a sort of popular cultural understanding of Berlin, but then also our photography work on the changes that were happening in Berlin in the early 90s. And the understanding that both political identity, the identity of immigration, the identity of a city and a country that was changing radically could have some architectural form. The political tensions were radical, and trying to find an architectural understanding of those was part of the exercise. And then, as we talked about this afternoon with Marco's students, the notion that you bring that work back and you curate it in a space. So this is the gallery at the University of Calgary. You take that research and you try to find a curatorial lens through which it can be shown, and the show outside is an example of that. The notion of the fetish, I find that with my early work with doing houses, it has to be addressed. The understanding that there's affectations, preoccupations, sometimes disturbing, that actually drive a project. And certainly the fetishization within architecture is driven. This is a work that was commissioned by En route magazine by us, and it really was about the fetishization of conspicuous consumption. The fetishization of water, a house in Tofino. The fetishization of partying, actually, in this case, is a house in Calgary, the Easy House. And then again, water, again, the fetishization of disaster. This was a house that's in permits right now that I'm not going to talk about in full, but the flood house in Calgary for friends of mine, where really their belongings were completely destroyed by the floods, and now they're rebuilding an identity around the same site, but with a new architecture that responds to that. And then finally, the notion of remote, the idea that we do work in the peripheries. Obviously, Toronto's not a periphery, but there's projects in Tofino, there's projects in Cape Sable Island, Nova Scotia, there's projects in the north. This is a video series we did for the Banff Centre for the Arts, and a book for Anthony Kendall around the periphery of Calgary and understanding Calgary's growth and radical growth. The cinematic drives the work, and the first project I'm going to talk about specifically is the Prix de Rome work. It really did become a cinematic exercise, and it developed an urban study that became an understanding of the city cinematically. So the words are speed, cinematic, speculation, politics, exile, identity. The work was driven by a fascination with post-World War II political and cultural movements within Italy. This is Mussolini's Final Fate, and work such as Billy Wilder's Roman Holiday, Fellini's La Strada, and most importantly, Fellini's 8½, really identifying a world around Rome of the gates, that notion of identity and exile articulated by the understanding of a series of passages and thresholds in and out of Rome, that early understanding of the Aurelian Wall as a construct, becoming a broader understanding as the city both shrunk and then expanded, and then really a contemporary understanding that the gates of Rome and the walls of Rome are the highway now that exists around Rome. That is the new and found border. That contemporary condition defined by contemporary culture. And just as a quick study, I'm going to go through some of our work around Porto San Sebastiano, which is really a kind of spatial construct of the Aurelian Wall, the gate, the remnants of the ancient Arco di Druso, and really understanding it as an intense urban space and how that can be engaged in certain ways. So this is the gate that actually becomes the Via Appia Antica down to the south and moves towards the Baths of Caracalla as you move into the city. As a surface, it's been marked and changed, and as a space, it's incredibly romanticized and incredibly powerful. We really started to study it in many ways, primarily as a surface as you move across cinematically, and how that surface has been marked and changed, what those individual markings mean, the various other apertures within the gate system, and then this is Porta Salaria, other gates that are adjacent. And then really moving back again to the contemporary condition. This is Termini Station, and it is a strange place. Rome is a ridiculous place to have a final station, an end station. It really should be a through station, but it's Rome and it needed one. So we really spent a lot of time looking at Termini, looking at it as a contemporary threshold condition to the city, and then looking at various different itineraries around the city that engage that part of the city, and particularly in contemporary terms, itineraries that engage contemporary Italian culture. Pasolini's A Violent Life became a key player. It's a novel structured around 5 itineraries. We started photographing those and filming them, and then started organizing those photographs and film snippets in a similar way as Walter Benjamin did in his Convolutes, in his Arcades project. So the Rome project really became a series of 3,500 small film clips. This is one slowed down. This is through the Arco di Druso. And then I'll show you just a series of them. They're numbered. This is a very quick, this is the gate at the Leonardo da Vinci Airport. Again, they all became 2 to, or half a second to 3/4 of a second film snippets that then started to become reconfigured in various ways. This is the one I showed the Canada Council actually when they asked me what I did with their money. It's that one. We started recomposing them. So this was a sort of filmic sequence. The first two we put together for Termini Station. And then a broader number. So we started composing them more thematically. That should be a film, but it's not. As several constructed new itineraries, so essentially creating new filmic cities through the re-articulation of these filmic constructs, and then started recomposing those, pulling out images, pulling out understanding. So really the Rome work became about a newly constructed filmic city around that research. We exhibited that work in several galleries across Canada. This is one, this is the Stride Gallery in Calgary, where really there was a constructed space, a space we built as an installation, and then a scrim across, created a space within that. The projected image, which is the cinematic space, was projected. So it was really coming together of the curatorial space of the gallery itself, the architectural space of the construct, and then the cinematic space. And we did several of these to various degrees across Canada. So that's the Rome work. 20 minutes left. Oh. I'm being timed by somebody who's a lot taller than me, so I'm paying attention. The Capilano Film School is the first of the real proper projects that I want to talk about. I've linked it to the Rome work because one of the reasons we found it so easy to develop I think a fairly in-depth level of research, and this was the work with film, the fact that I've taught studios in film and several of the contributors to this project. And then the names that I mentioned actually earlier have all contributed to all these projects in various different ways. Some of them, for instance, Jofi and Guy and Nikolai have been in both CannonDesign and the art-based work and the AKA work. So I'm not going to specifically talk about who made which images, but the people that I mentioned, most of which are in this room, have been part of this work. CapU is really a kind of surface cinema, an identity project. It's an identity for the university cinema because obviously its program lends itself to that. It really became a machine for the cinematic experience. The starting point is Plasma's, I think, fairly nuanced understanding about the relationship between architecture and cinema, and building on that in that we really we found a fairly easy route into looking at the way films are made, understanding of the way films are made, and allowing an architectural referencing. So the early cardboard studies that always become part of the work, and then really 4 words that helped define this project as it developed. One is movement, the understanding that within cinema, a projected movement and an anticipated movement is something that is sometimes in tension with the actual movement in place and how that works. The notion of the frame, Plasma talks about the framed view and the fact that subconsciously we understand what's beyond that frame, and architecture certainly functions in that way. The notion of the glimpse, the fact that there's a certain piece of information, certainly the Rome work was about the peripheral glimpse in a way, and that glimpse embodies or is part of architectural experiences fully and completely as a more direct view. And then the notion of the peripheral, the fact that there's a continued experience that we're not fully cognizant of, but certainly is part of our understanding of the spatial construct around us. So these 4 drivers really push the work forward. It allowed us to engage with the clients and the users in a very, very clear and pragmatic way in many ways, but also in a theoretical and a conceptual way that they were very sympathetic about. The site itself is in North Vancouver. It's got mountains to the back. So this is the campus, Capilano University. It's essentially a gateway building for what was the back end of the campus. As you move around into the campus, it really does become both a gateway. So it is an identity building in that sense. It's a beautiful, beautiful physical landscape, and we were sort of put at the back end of what is a challenged campus in some ways, but a newly revitalized one. The views to the north and south, to the mountains and back, and then the views east and west became absolutely key. So the first phase was the ones north and south. The second phase of the building orients itself alternatively. The composition of the project is really about these grounded elements. You'll see in the work there's the core elements, big chunks of very, very hard concrete. An understanding that the work is supported by laboratories and certainly a soundstage at the back, and then a very strong expression of the bar building, the classroom building, as a big, essentially gateway project. We'll just move through these. So phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is essentially the bar building and the support, and then phase 2 moves in underneath this. They're still looking for money for phase 2. A sort of complex, and I think, again, tension exists within the project. Certainly tension exists within the project when the buses come in and move through the project. Another driver is really the relationship between the skin of the building and film. As a laboratory for film, every surface, both inside and outside this project, is seen as a place in which both film can be recorded and film can be projected. So there's this continuous relationship with the students, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how the building is implicated as a sort of blank canvas. Sequence, there's a series of sequences in this point, sectional sequences through the building. So this is the section through the bar as it exists over the bus turnaround. Section through the public space as it evolves. And then the section through the primary projection space. So this is the primary cinematic space. There's one inside and one outside the project. And this is technically viewable through the project and viewable from the rest of the campus. The bar building itself is a big truss form, sits and hangs above that, almost independently, except for where it meets those cores. And then the sections through the other direction. The long bar building being cut through with the strong concrete core. It's a very raw building in many ways. The projection space itself as you move through the primary public space. The link to when the addition is met, and then the section through the addition. And this is really the key public space, the projection space. This was published in Canadian Architect. This space itself, not the bar building, but this space itself became the key image. And then the plaza, the views of the building. And for us, the test was really this imagery put together for either award submissions, communicating with the client, that sort of thing, and then how it really found itself, what the relationship was to the final product and that image. This is the sort of Donald Judd-esque bar building sticking out over the landscape, the cores themselves, and then the privileging of the interior of the cores as clear spaces, the projection space itself, and then the building itself as a sort of landscape element, and really absolutely revitalizing the identity of the campus itself. This is a photograph by Dylan Durst, who I think is in here. The next project I'm going to talk about is another CannonDesign project. This is an absolutely key and important project for us. The whole team, I think, is here right now for this project. It's both a university client, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the YMCA, so it's a complex client group. It's in a community, it's in Brantford, Ontario, so a community that has several challenges. But it's also one that both the pursuit of the success in achieving and then the projection of design excellence has helped us create a building, I think, that is a much better project. The words that are linked to this, contingent, speed, surface, identity, and fetish. The fetish is really in the skin of the building. The building is really a bar building that sits at the street level. Essentially, there's a road, there's a series of ramps, and then there's a series of large sports programming pushed into the hill. I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea about the context. If you don't know, Brantford. So the site is a historic part of Brantford that essentially was demolished. So a series of historic buildings that were taken down before we were engaged in the project on a very steep hill that looks out towards the landscape. That historic context was documented by the team as a way of, first of all, researching the community, researching the grain of the context, trying to understand that context, understanding that, yes, of course, we wanted to do a very contemporary building, but we also wanted to understand both the political context of tearing down this much of your community and the actual physical, cultural context of what was there before. So this is the site as it exists now. Actually, it's got a construction trailer on it. It's essentially an embankment or an escarpment within the community. Those buildings existed on that landscape. Sorry, I'm trying to fix my Madonna thing here. That was generated by three understandings: the memory of the site, the movement across the site, and there's two distinct ways in which we can move across the site through the project, and the landscape as it's as it's embedded in that. The early sketch that really talks about the horizon line being up high in the building. It's not a ground plane building, it's pushing itself fundamentally into the ground, and the ground plane shifts and changes. And then the various forces that are driving the project, whether it's the existence of the historic buildings, the existence of the green spaces within the community itself, the view planes from the potential project, and then its relationship within those systems. So the building itself is really a series of very large, very tough spaces, a large gymnasium, which is also a gathering space for the university and the YMCA, an aquatic center, a series of small gyms. And then spatially, there's actually several people in this room who can talk about this building more succinctly than I can. I'm recognizing that as I'm talking. The fact that those exist underneath this contiguous landscape, the fact that you can move up and into the land, it's essentially capped by essentially a re-emerging or a reforming of the ground. And then the architecture itself, while tectonically resonant, powerful, becomes at a much lower scale. It has academic programming, it has office programming, it has a different scale of programming. So from the main Harmony Square, which is the main public plaza in Brantford, you look across this landscape, you look across the plinth that we're creating, and you see this sort of singular form that allows you to move in and out and underneath. These are some of the studies of the historic context, how we sort of built a strategy towards the skin of this building, and then more in depth how the screening of the bar building and its programming could reflect that historical context, that historical patterning. This has become much more complex. There's been a First Nation component to this. There's been several layers to this, and this really is I think the fetishized component of this project, the understanding what the screen can do both functionally and poetically. The project really is about moving across the site, either on Water Street below, moving up the two landscapes, a thinner ramp, a big landscaped element as you move up, essentially engaging the gym, and then another smaller ramp as you move up towards the street, and then finding yourself in a very, very permeable state where you can move onto Coburg Street in many, many different ways. And then a much more direct, internalized sequence that moves across that path with a heavily figured, heavily sculpted public stair that moves you up in a much more direct way. So these are the two systems that have sort of informed the development of the project, the three systems, the skin, and then the circulation. So this is the project as it stood in recent times. It's changed a bit lately as we're moving through working drawings and starting construction. But the notion of the continuous skin remains, the notion of a clear entrance, the notion of a clear landscape, and then a bar building. And the role of design recognition, particularly something as significant as either a Canadian Architect Award or a PA Award, or certainly the AIA PA Award, is absolutely clear in the success of this project. It allowed them to gain funding, I think, more quickly. It allowed the building to be spoken about in a much different way. And we sort of take great pride in the fact that we maintained that commitment and the fact that the client has embraced it as part of the identity of the work. This is the entrance below, further form of the entrance, and then the view from Coburg. This is the figured stair. Essentially, this is imagery created by Kate, who studies here, for a recent award submission. Blued steel, a really tough material set within a concrete and wood context with huge amounts of light cracking through the building and its various sort of cracks in the landscape, and then moving up to the street above. So that's what am I doing? We're good? Done? We got half an hour left. The Will Roth project is a couple of small house projects. So this again is a project that in terms of the contributors to the project, they span across all practices. This has been a key project for us. This is a project for a client who looked at our work. It was after the Rome work, asked us if we'd be interested in doing a house in which he, his Weimaraner dog, and his 500 pieces of Italian modernist glass could exist in a nice way. It's a project that's in permitting phase right now in Calgary, and it's on the mountains. It really is a kind of radical notion of how a house, a home, can be also a curatorial act, an act of curation. Its demands in terms of functional program, family density of family, that sort of thing, were absolutely minimized so that it really focused on his experience of of his possessions to a certain degree, and possessions that he engaged with consistently and understood to a level that was unfathomable. Really, the most interesting thing about this project is actually the process in which we undertook with the client. It was a very, very intimate, I'm not going to say very, very intimate experience. It was a fairly intimate experience for the usual architect-client relationship. But it was one where we spent a lot of time sitting with the client, a lot of time at his home, and a lot of time drawing and sketching with him, which is not something that we typically, certainly within the AK practice, typically did. So we became very knowledgeable of both his understanding of the world and his understanding of his collection. And these series of slides are really just excerpts from a vast collection of this imagery. We talked, in the discussion I had with Marco's students earlier, we talked about the role of models in understanding what you're doing, and in some cases, obviously, that's didactic. You're showing somebody what a building looks like. In another case, you're talking about a series of ideas and what certain preoccupations are. So these are 3 models that were made for the project, 2 of which are in the show, 1 of which is with the client, which talk about different understandings of the world that this project tries to talk about. In each case, whether it's the tower element, a very strong, the element really that pushes this building out of the ground and supports the plinth, or whether it's the relationship between those two and the fact that there's a material tension between them, or the public realm, and in this case, this model, if you look in the gallery, it's made of billet aluminum, really, really fetishizing and somehow overplaying certain components of the building was absolutely key, because there was very little to hang on to in other ways. And then a radically minimalist, radically sort of reduced version of this thing is a couple of pieces of pipe. But really the building is pulled down into a tower. The tower is fundamentally both the circulation of the building, the gallery space for the glass, and any private realm that exists, and the bar is really the public realm as it moves through. If anybody knows Calgary, this is the escarpment looking down towards the city from the north, looking over the Bow River towards the mountains. There's about, I guess, 150, 200 meter drop from here to here. So the view is spectacular. The house is really made of a series of spaces: the garage space, a small courtyard, and then the main public space, the bedroom above, and then a series of rooms below. It's inserted into a fairly older neighborhood by Calgary standards, but some challenged context in some ways. Very reduced. We're trying to, again, as I mentioned with Marco's students, are really reduced. If anything, the process is actually taking things away, creating a complexity through tensions rather than a complexity through other means. The floor plans are very straightforward: a series of rooms in the tower building, the public space, and then the main bedroom. Early studies of the project, and then a series of the both more abstract but also more, I think, poetically charged imagery. He also collects old Volkswagens. And an interesting and powerful piece for us, and one that really recognized a kind of an understanding of our place within Calgary at that time, and certainly where houses could land within the broader practice. This is another small project. This is actually in the middle of development. This won a PA award in 2012. Nikolai is pulled as a project partner in this. He's been heavily involved in the development of both the architecture and the imagery. It really is 2 words: remote and fetish. It's remote because it's in Cape Sable Island, Nova Scotia. It's the absolute southernmost piece of private property in Nova Scotia, on the southwestern tip of Cape Sable Island. That fetishization is expressed in the creation of these documents using sandpaper as a way in, talking about the incredible toughness of this environment. It's not the bucolic world of Chester and Lunenburg, which Brian McKay-Lyons, who's a great friend of mine, really talks about. It's a really much tougher world. It's the smell The smell of fiberglass resin is prevalent when the boats get built in this neighborhood. The text starts to talk about that and the more poetic issues of sky, horizon, but then the reality that there is a material of veracity. Nova Scotia, the site is down here, right on the southern tip. It's surrounded, that's the site, that's the existing house on the site. That's the weather for about 350 days of the year, but that's what it's like for the rest of the time. It's surrounded by white sand beaches that are both very remote, they're isolated, and they're very, very quiet. A series of studies around the project. At a certain point, the existing house was contemplated to be maintained for code reasons or for bylaw reasons. In the end, that was not necessary, but a series of models were created, actually mostly at the Banff Center with some people here, looking at those studies, using the existing house as a sort of artifact, and then we realized we didn't have to do that, so the house became a much more objectified, a much more contemporary, a much more articulated, something clearly within the realm of the practice. The site itself is very small. Essentially, it's the size of any expressed deck in the project. There's a small storage unit for motorcycles, and then otherwise it's for people, bedroom, and then a studio art-making space that really becomes the primary space of the building. It's about two different views towards what is an amazing landscape and a dynamic one in the sense that there's a lighthouse and an island and a bird sanctuary just beyond the building. The long panoramic view and the small slot view. Again, this house played heavily in the show about the cinematic experience. The building really is tough. It's covered in, or the potential, the proposed surfacing is a corrugated steel grating all around the building so that the wall surfaces themselves are protected, but also the roof can be engaged and used. Simple structure. Very, very simple plan. An homage to, in a certain degree, to Brian McKay Lyons and his simplicity of form of plan, the sections as you move through, and an understanding of the place as a hard place of making. The boats that are made here are Cape Sable Islanders. They're fiberglass boats for lobster fishing. It is a working, intense environment that has nothing that has to do with just the tides and the seasons. And a series of imagery. This is over the last 2 years we've been developing as a way of talking about the project. Because this exists well within AKA, and it exists within Nikolai and I's context, the imagery, the presentation material is really sort of challenging. We're trying to figure out how to present this building in both an evocative way that talks realistically about the way the building is both made and constructed, but also that powerfully talks about the materiality and the way it would be experienced. Potentially, the site can be doubled and another piece attached in the same size. Again, a much tougher one for much larger pieces of art, but again, the engagement of the bird sanctuary and the view is key. A very, very important project for the small practice, and certainly important for the way in which we're developing formal strategies for the larger work. Again, this is the extent of the site is the building's setback, zero setback on the back, and then the deck takes it to the front. It's a very tiny site. It's a lot of images. The last project I'm going to talk about is the shim. And I was going to, if I'd run out of time, I was going to bail on this. Which is strange because it's a project that's consumed, I think, a lot of the people in the room. Certainly, it's consumed me for the last 4 years. The CHUM is the McGill, not the McGill Hospital, sorry, the University of Montreal Hospital in Montreal. It's a $2 billion project. It's the largest construction site in North America right now. Largest healthcare project in North America that's being seen as one single construction phase. It's a controversial project in lots of ways. I'll talk a little bit about the context, but it's on Saint Denis. If you know Montreal, you know the importance of that street, and its cross street is René Lévesque. It's a building that is essentially, in our scale, moving. I've willfully placed the hawk and the SHUM next to each other, just in terms of dealing how these notions of trans-architecture can really establish scale. And I spoke with Marco earlier about the fact that this building we have to speak about almost separately because its scale is so radical, its program it's so driven by program. But still, in the hopes that we're managing to pull both moments and an overarching understanding of the city, and actually put something back into the city through what is a really tough P3 environment that has design qualities and hopefully significant design qualities. So the project, I mean, one way of looking at it is through this conceptual lens, but when you see a project like this seems almost like an affectation, but it does relate itself to certain words. But really what it relates itself to is its demands as a building. Its demands as both a program, its demands as a site, its demands as a building within what I think is one of the most important design cities in North America. So these are the numbers. The 772 bedrooms, 10,000 employees, 5,000 students, 443 exam rooms. The art program itself I'm fully engaged in the art program as a member of its committee. It's the largest one since Expo 67. It's a $7 million public art program. Various ways in which you can manifest lots of documentation. Ross Carter-Wingrove, who's in the audience, knows this much to his chagrin. And any number of different ways in which you can unpack a project this big, particularly the 12,000 doors. And this is an image which you show to the you show to the door contractor, actually. And talk about really what the scale of this building is. And through the use of the Revit model, the building, the information management model, we can pull out different pieces of information, but this cloud of doors really talks about both the scale, the materiality, the level of investment. And then going from 12,000 doors to sketches that are literally this big, that were made I think probably 6 years ago now by Nikolai, really trying to understand what this building means on both the Saint-Denis side and the Sanguinet side. So we've moved back and forth and tried to understand this building in lots of different ways. We've used it as a real design laboratory, at the same time as successfully delivering a very, very challenging project within a challenging context of a P3 environment. Its context is Old Montreal, the plateau, and really that link in between. The Ville-Marie Expressway moves across the site. There's a research center that's recently been completed, and it takes up essentially these three sites within the city. Saint-Denis is the green line, Rennes-Lebec is the line above. Key site within Montreal, very important. Also, its context within large buildings of the city itself became very clear. We had to address, just because of the politics of the project. So its relationship in terms of Place Ville-Marie and the mountain, Montreal, the various, the CIBC Tower, which is considered one of the great towers of the city. And then really how to talk about this, and how to talk about this project. There's 100 different stories, and I've presented this, I've probably presented this project over 100 times in the last 4 years, from the premier to the nurses to the art committee. And really one of the clearest ways we found, at least to talk about it architecturally, is to break it down into a series of design books. And at this point, these design books look at the concepts of the building, the massing of the building, the public interface of the building, as a way of talking about the public space, because the clinical space, the hospital rooms, the various departments that exist in the hospital are something else. And then the skin of the building. It's got 1 million square feet of triple glazed curtain walls, so the investment that's necessary within the skin of the building is absolutely fundamental. The concepts of the building are driven really by these 5. And again, this is a more pragmatic understanding of the world, but also a way to try to engage the client in a process that is not normative for a P3 hospital delivery. How do you make massive? How do you make something this big in a city that hasn't seen a new building this big in a long time? Those points are essentially understanding its context, understanding that you're putting an 18-story tower in a world that is, in some cases, very fine-grained and historically resonant. That context is driven by the mandate to maintain a historic steeple of the church and the historic rectory, which becomes part of the building, but also giving back to the public, using the scale of the building to create a plaza, a public plaza, which has a teaching component inside it, and manipulating the form such that it doesn't have an incredibly detrimental effect on its context. Understanding a hospital without understanding the nuances of its program is impossible. So we really needed to understand where the tensions between both the clinical programming, the public space programming, the art program, and the urban design mandates really met. Finding the moments within that, again, you've got incredibly strict budget limitations. You're working, you're having to find money in certain places. You have the scale to work with, but the general, really finding the moments in which you can invest in privilege beyond others in order to make these moments work. And this is the view up Saint Denis, where an internalized space of contemplation, which is the historic chapel within the hospital, the glass wall that engages Saint Denis and the various elements behind, the auditorium building, which pushes out and engages Saint Denis, the library. So there's a series of components along the street, and then the 3 strong towers that move above that. Engaging the public, we've created a system which we call the device, which I'll get into in more detail, but that's made of a whole, it's 2 city blocks, so it's made of a whole system of solutions that both circulate you vertically, move you horizontally, and then create these places for both cultural engagement, art engagement, respite, and engagement of the city. And then the scale is absolutely key, the understanding that this building functions at radical scales, from the retail scale of Saint Denis to the scale of Place Ville-Marie. An early concept drawing of the building, really looking at how the hospital towers, the existing steeple, or actually the rebuilt steeple, exists within a plaza, and then how the skin of this building can be sort of remediate the scale of it in a certain way, not really address each floor to floor, but a sketch of mine, a sort of development sketch of mine from a couple of years ago, where we're starting to really define trying to emphasize the slimness of these towers, trying to break down that mass as they're viewed through the city, but then also trying to create a plinth and understanding of the hospital components and where you go, and then the urban components as you move across Saint Denis. The massing of the building is really unpacked in certain ways. There were various different versions of it. But the fact that there's 3 very strong towers, there's program elements of the plinth in between that, and again, the context. The public space and the existing steeple, which is rebuilt, access into the parking, and then the public interface along Saint Denis. The hardcore public elements, so the more program-based elements, the library, some of the restaurants behind. So really this becomes an urban building, regardless of its program. The amphitheater, which is the primary, both iconic element of the project, and also the primary teaching facility. It's a university hospital. The circulation, the primary ground plane circulation of that element, moving around the public plaza, and this becomes the armature for the so-called device. The cores, and the primary hospital circulation, which moves up into the 18 stories of the building, and then building that up with various program components. The cores themselves, the diagnostic plinth, the program elements of the hospital, the bed towers, the 772 bed towers, the clinical building, which becomes a sort of backdrop to this, to the auditorium, and then the office tower itself. And one of the innovations we brought to this project was really separating the clinical program elements and the office elements out from the bed tower and the diagnostics. It allowed us to propose a project that was within budget. The notion of scale became absolutely key. The idea of the fine-grained scale along the street in the first 2 or 3 stories. Lots of transparency, lots of artifacts, lots of elements in which to engage the user. The medium level, the sort of plinth level, art became a very large component. There's a very innovative art component on the curtain wall of that building. And then the upper grade, the sort of tops of the towers, the relationship this building has with the rest of the city. View from the other side. And then the auditorium building itself. This is a series of drawings we did to try and understand what the skin of the auditorium is doing. It's got a large teaching facility inside it and a series of small meeting rooms, but it really becomes the circulation device for moving into the hospital. The main entrance for the hospital is behind the auditorium. You move in and the main entrance is here. So this really becomes the sort of hood ornament or iconic element in which the SHUM will identify itself. Its relationship with the landscape of the plaza and the skin's relationship with that landscape, how they're talking to each other. And then the more in-depth development of the interiors and how the skin, the interstitial spaces, and then the program spaces inside merge. This is a very important part of the project, probably the smallest program component, but also in terms of putting the face of the project forward, in terms of creating an identity for the new hospital itself, which is the coming together of 3 hospitals. It's become absolutely key. The view down to Old Montreal, and then the building itself as it's forming. The building is skinned up to about here right now. This building is not constructed yet, and the office building is not constructed. This is not what this tower is. I'll show you some imagery. The human interface, the engagement of the public space was our primary concern, using a very straightforward circulation device in order to move around the building, and then allowing that to become articulated in different ways. Carrefour de Science is the French and badly pronounced version of it. A series of objects, whether it's the steeple, the rectory as an artifact, the skin, the various elements within that, the space of contemplation, and how those elements are sort of organized within the larger floor plan, and how those elements get expressed as finer grain elements on the skin of the building. So again, this is the Saint Denis side. This is the space of contemplation. It protrudes beyond the building. It's covered in copper. It's a beautiful space that engages both the street through its view planes and the space inside the building, and defines a series of entrances for the hospital. The primary entrance for the hospital as a privileged element, a privileged box, and then the library at the corner. And then the device itself, and how this really moves from the subway station up into the main public space of the Vigier corner with the steeple. It becomes a strong architectural element, both the staircase, similarly to Wilfrid Laurier, and it becomes a strong architectural device. It's essentially a 10-foot deep drywall and glass component that moves itself through the hospital. You always understand where you are in relation to this piece of architecture. That becomes the space of contemplation. It becomes a series of staircases and elevators, moves down towards the main public atrium, which is a 4-story atrium with a series of staircases and escalators in it, and bridges, moves across the main entry and into the René-Lévesque entry in the library. So this idea that a system of continuous architectural elements that are clearly linked, physically linked, through a syntax and through materiality, becomes the driving force for the public space and links the staircases and the circulation. And this is the Revit model that pulls out those elements within the section, moving up from the subway. And again, similar to Wilfrid Laurier, these sculptural stairs that punctuate each of the major public spaces. And these are under construction now. I'll show you a few images a little bit. The notion that the artifacts, there was a mandate to maintain the steeple and a mandate to maintain the rectory. Our decision was to enclose the rectory, similar to, say, Michael Landy's semi-detached at the Tate Britain, where this really becomes an internalized component, and then pull the building away from the steeple. The steeple does exist. There's an art program, a sound art going in there, but it does exist as an independent piece, independently curated. The sequence as you move through it to the main entry of the building, around the auditorium, primary entrance, the bed tower building, the clinical building above, and the main entrance to the hospital, and the linking of those elements as you move around. This is the recent construction shots of the staircases in the large atrium space. The Vigier corner with the staircases that I showed you, this is as it's going to get clad in various components and escalators. And these slides are really for the people in the room who've actually worked on this project. And everybody else, of course, but some people haven't seen it for a while. The skin of the project became an independent study. There was early scripting studies. We used various different programs to try and understand how the skin of the project could be both understand its scale, reflect its scale, but also break down the scale in terms of the floor-to-floor height. So we developed a whole system of articulation that allowed different floors to be dealt with in different ways. So it really did undermine the fact that there's a total of 18 floors. The building is viewed across the city, from the island, from the bridge, from the South Shore. So really understanding it at different scales and understanding its graphic quality became absolutely key. Those became a series of studies that resulted in a final patterning that's now on the building. And it also became a driver for the landscape of the auditorium building itself. And this is the current, while slightly out of date, but almost current view of the building as it's emerging out of the ground on Saint Denis. Concrete platform and then the final form. And I'm going to finish with $2 billion worth of your tax dollars.
I'm sure Andrew would be happy to take any questions if there are any. It's a little dark out there, so wave your hand.
That was a very clear presentation.
Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, great.
I was just wondering, Andrew, whether when you're creating these works with your team, the relationship that you have with the public interface that you're talking about, is that something where you, I guess for lack of a better term, try to initiate new behavioral encounters with the architecture, new negotiations with space between the public and the space you develop?
I think for sure the small scale project, the Roth House, tries to radically do that. So the notion of a domestic architecture as is normally engaged, he was very much interested in that experiment. How does he bring people into his home? And it's not a gallery, and it's not a house, but it's some sort of curated expression of his understanding of the world. So at a small scale, that really tries to do that. There's no question that with the Shum, what was driving, I hope I'm answering your question, what was driving that was the fact that it was such a dense site and there was so much had to be put on it, but we also needed to navigate from two really important streets, and we needed to let the architecture really help people navigate it. We tell the team it's one thing to do a house that 100 people are going to see over the next 30 years. It's another thing to do a building where 5,000 people are going to go through the door. So the notion that, and there's so many different layers to the question. There's information, there's the radical, the fact that many of these people are in crisis, and that position of crisis has to be understood, and the architecture becomes, the architectural qualities become to a certain degree null and void. But certainly for the visitors, the guest experience, and the user experience, the people who are working in the hospital, I think we did by articulating this device and by actually pushing the device up into the building where we can in various places. And by making sure that this device almost always had, or not always had, but at many punctuation points had a direct relationship with the city, we did try to change the way in which hospitals are navigated in that project. And certainly the experience in which hospitals, certainly what the users came back to us and said hospitals are experientially like, particularly in Quebec, which is a system in crisis. The overt challenging of that experience, I would guess, is opportunistic for us. If it's even hinted at that's one of the opportunities, then certainly we'll engage it. It's not, I think, a primary driver or preoccupation with the practice generally. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I've got one. The two towers that you were showing, it's primarily the patient rooms. The configuration of those. I'm just wondering about the development of the floor plate, the proximity to daylight, all the kind of issues that impact directly on the patient experience. Talk a bit about that.
Yes, like I said, there's 100 stories about it, and the clinical story is one where the planning principle for the hospital, the real expertise with hospital design talks about often, but essentially it's all single rooms. Every floor above, I think it's the 7th floor, is dedicated to bed towers. There's some adjacencies to some of the clinical uses. So essentially from about here up and every bed tower has a significant exposure to natural light. So single rooms, natural light all the way around, and every room has a view to the city. So there's always an understanding of where you are within the city itself. There's so essentially the slimness of the bed tower is enforced actually by that tight relationship. Really, there's a whole series of slides about the phasing of the project, because even though it's a single-phase project, it's being built continuously. There is an existing hospital here that gets torn down after this is complete and fully functioning, and then the next phase, the auditorium building, and the office building, and the clinical building get built. So that site guideline, the fact that there's St. Luke Hospital here, really defined the depth of this site. It was like the conversation we had earlier. Hospitals are fundamentally driven by the fact that so much of it has to exist within, and in this case, such a tight. It's very different from the McGill Hospital, if anybody's seen that in Montreal, was going up. Only Montreal would build $2 billion hospitals at the same time. But that's the only suburban site really that's with any proximity to downtown, and it's much more spread out. So that density, this is a absolute sheer wall, an 18-story sheer wall off a fairly tight street, Vigier and Saint Denis. So that density, that sort of intent to pack all this in is evident. And we tried to do that with the skin, so it's got a very, very tight skin condition. This is all louvers, and the louvers are coexistent with the curtain wall. There's a very, very refined and super precise machine-like quality to this wing. The patient towers themselves are fully glazed, roughly Montreal north and south. It's not direct north and south. And then there's much less glazing along the sort of dark faces of the tower, because in many cases it's just the end of a couple of hallways, and the bedrooms are facing north and south. So it's allowed this very, very strong horizontal or vertical articulation along Saint Denis. And it's a very, very tough, that medium grain part of the building is really tough. It's heavily engaging the public along the street face. This is programming that's very dark, very difficult to find the appropriate, the opportunity for fenestration of windows and daylight, and then the towers themselves start to light up. I don't know if that answers your question.
Question over here?
Initially, the project you had like 3 levels, three levels of the grain in the facade, but I didn't see. So you said you have like a small grain
Yep.
at the floor level, and then that would be going on the top.
Well, on a
art treatment.
just using this image quickly, and I can move to another image. This is essentially the Saint Denis interface. It's a 2.5 to 3-story plinth, which is heavily, heavily transparent. We've used low iron glass, so it's incredibly transparent. The elements inside will be lit. You'll be able to see roughly between different components of the building. You'll be able to see into the building about 10, 20, 30 meters into the building. You'll be able to understand its depth from the street as you move down Saint Denis. Then there's the articulation of these elements. This steeple element, which was mandated to be maintained, the rectory sort of facade that's inside, and then the various other smaller components, the space of contemplation, the chapel, the auditorium. So the fine grain, it's an interesting question, because it actually points to whether we've succeeded in those notions or not. The fine grain, we think we're managing. It's actually, we walk along the street now, we understand how it functions, we understand how it works. It's the medium grain that actually has become difficult and challenging. And I'll move back to, can't be that far away. I think I'll use this one. So the medium grain itself is more difficult. So to a certain degree, there's bedrooms up here, there's slightly larger rooms, and the plinth drops back. So we've tried to articulate a very clear horizontal line while maintaining the strong vertical element that is that medium grain. The issue with the hospital is that's where a lot of the diagnostic elements are, a lot of the really tough programming is. It's really, in many, many cases, a stretch to actually try and get windows and fenestration there. So what we've really tried to do is use various components. Just a second. Try to go to the sketch. I'll go to this. Various components. So there was a mandate to keep granite, to have a granite component of the building. The unwritten manifestation of that is that there's a huge granite component that exists at the base and it relates to the rest of the city. Our strategy was to take components of the curtain wall, components of the facade, and layer that with a granite element and say that this mandated materiality is going to support this notion that there's a fine grade part of the city, a medium grade part, and then the upper grade and the large part, which is really the expression of the three towers, and then a large louvered. This is the motor for the hospital. All the mechanical is on the top of the clinical room, and then a very, very slim office tower. So really the challenge is in this zone. Whether we've done it or not, we've tried to break up these components. We've tried to break up them both horizontally and vertically and support them to a kind of datum and change the materiality. But in the end, we also felt that it was really key to allow those to support the tower elements. The other side, this is actually the Saint-Denis side. We don't really talk much about the Saint-Denis side. It's much more dense, much more urban, and it's a much flatter version of this. I don't know, did that answer your question at all?
More or less, but I wanted you to talk about, I mean, I thought the grain, I understand the transparency and how it works, but how do you address the polygram, which is something that someone asked before. I thought the grain was meant to address the public, the sidewalk, the condition of the street. I mean, how do you deal with the polygram at that level when it's existing?
Well, it actually does so. I'm trying to figure out, probably the best slide is maybe the blue here. So as you move back into the building, so there is one continuous glass facade. So it's about I don't know, 100 meters long, continuous glass facade, 2 stories, heavily transparent. The street itself is reflected essentially as you move into the building and down onto the street. There's a 4 or 5 meter wide ramp that essentially coexists with the sidewalk completely. So the first architectural element inside the building is actually completely coexistence with the sidewalk. It's the it deals with our universal accessibility mandate. It also deals with linking what is termed as a space of cultural manifestation, is the translation. So a space in which music, cultural events can occur, a place in which people can eat, and that's linked by a ramp that is immediately adjacent to and engaging the sidewalk. The next level is essentially a translucent panel, a glass panel, that from this level is coexistent with the sidewalk, and then it flattens and it becomes the main public area, the main public gathering space of the hospital. But it's completely, until when you get a little further down here, it drops. And here it's a little bit difficult to perceive, but certainly through this, you're looking well into the hospital. So that engagement of the hospital zone through the use of this public circulation corridor, the use of a fairly fine grain element to differentiate these two spaces, and then a heavily articulated and heavily programmed space behind really tries to engage that space. The steeple is a different, and then there's a public space that reflects that right here, public, so where it's seasonally appropriate, there's an open public gathering space here and a small plaza around the steeple. The steeple itself is more difficult. In the sense it's a concrete reconstruction of the existing steeple where the existing stones have been put back on. Again, that was a mandate that came with the project. But what we've done with that is we've created a sound art component inside it. So there's a cultural thing going on that talks about how this gives back to the society. There's also a staircase that moves you up to a deck, which is the main cafeteria space for the hospital behind. So these punctuations along the street, whether it's the small plaza with the steeple, the open public, a small open public area, and then a small enclosed public area, both with similar programs. The artifact, which really is an artifact and lit in certain ways at night, the depth of the space underneath, and then this large element which really provides a sort of canopy condition in which you can move in underneath, hopefully provide a sort of intuitive way to get into the building. And everything is sort of a scale. The actual surface area of this in a series of studies is actually the resultant surface area of this, which has a relationship with the surface area of the library. Again, in the top corner, the library becomes key. It's the corner of Saint-Denis and Levesque. There's a public access, there's a screened element, and then there's a stronger program element in behind. This is still in design development for phase 2, so we're not quite sure how it's going to manifest itself. But again, there's a staircase that, if you can't actually access it, it shows you that you can publicly access various elements of the hospital. that more detail?
How was the form of the main auditorium generated? Where is it
The long version of it is we actually had an in-house competition for this auditorium. This was really interesting. We did do that. In the end, I drew it, but the competition was interesting. It was really, it was using, and some of the people here will tell you, we actually said we're gonna spend 2 or 3 days. We had, I think we had 7 versions of how this thing. There was no mandate. All we knew is that we had to have an auditorium building, and we had to somehow engage Saint-Denis. There was no mandate to open it up as a plaza. In fact, there was significant pushback for separating the program of these 2 buildings with the public plaza, because we've actually developed a fairly complex way in which you get into this building by going underneath the plaza. But yeah, the process was there was an open competition, and then through the open, there was 7 people. Through the discussions of that, it sort of trickled down into something that became much more object-like. In the end, I think once that occurred, once we decided that we could talk to the client about bringing you into this building underneath, once we didn't have to link it to the building, then it really became a development of this object. There's a materiality component. There's a version of the slideshow that talks about, in fact, I'm sorry it's not here, but this is covered in copper material. So there's a historical reference to Montreal, the copper-covered buildings, the fact that they age beautifully in Montreal, and the fact that this building will turn from a copper building into a green, patina building within 7 or 8 years. So there's lots of layers to it in order to sort of push forward something that's both contemporary, very object-like, and hopefully formally compelling. There was lots of buttons we had to push in terms of the historical context, the users, and the urban design forum within Montreal. I don't know if that answered your question. The other version of it is it's a really nice shape, so we just kept drawing it and then extruding it. It was much flatter at one point. It's a bit ungainly in its height now, but not immeasurably so. Anything else?
Okay, well, if there are no other questions for Andrew, I just want to thank you very much for this evening's lecture. Thank you all for coming, and please join us for our future lectures as well. Thanks a lot.